Hello, and thank you for joining us at our Healthy Minds Speaker Series. It's great that you can be with us today. We are in week 8, if you can believe it. So in some ways, time has flown by, and I think in other ways, people feel like time has stood still. But thank you for joining us today. We have as guests today, we have Dr. Dayna Lee-Baggley, who I'll introduce more in a moment. But hi, Dr. Lee-Baggley, great to see you. And hi, Dr. Bill Howitt, great to have you here again. I'm Peter Neufeld, and I'm part of the HR team here at Maple Leaf. We'll take the same format as we have in prior weeks. So what we'll be doing is we'll be having a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll be spending the remainder of our time hearing from you through Q&A. If you have any questions, just look at the icon at the top right corner of your screen, click on that at any time, and then we'll be addressing as many questions as we're able. Dr. Lee-Baggley, it's actually been 4 weeks since you were here. And last time you were with us, you were speaking on how to handle anxiety when you're working on the front line. And I know it was very helpful in terms of the tips and tools that you were giving to people. My wife actually works in a long-term care home, and I shared some of that with her, and it was extremely relevant. So before we jump into the topic today, which is caring for your elderly relatives, which I'm sure for folks is very meaningful and something we haven't had a chance to address yet. I wanted to see how you're doing in terms of how has the adjustment been, even over these last few weeks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me back. So I work at the hospital and sort of one of the frontline providers providing care. I work with cancer patients and transplant patients. So again, I actually thought I was going to feel really relieved when all the lockdowns ended and things started to reopen. And I was quite surprised to find out I wasn't just relieved. I was relieved, and I was also anxious, and I was also sad, and I was also angry. And there's actually a lot of mixed emotions about things reopening. So in the healthcare system, there's a huge backlog of patients now that we need to deal with. And so it feels like we're heading into like another stressful period of dealing with this backlog. And so it's been harder than I thought it would be. I thought it would just sort of be a sense of relief, and it's actually been quite mixed.
It's amazing how people continue to have the whole spectrum of emotion. I've been hearing that from a number of individuals. And there's often an expectation, like you say, of positive emotions would be coming, and yet people can be surprised. And one of the things, and you always demonstrate so well, and Dr. Howitt, you do, is the idea of not judging the emotion, but accepting and acknowledging. And thank you for your openness. So over to you in terms of caring for our elderly relatives.
Yeah, great. So thank you for having me to talk about this topic. So I'll advance to the next slide. Okay, so the first point I wanted to make was just to recognize that if you are taking care of elderly relatives, either people who live close to you or people who live far away from you, just to recognize that that's stressful, right? It is stressful to be a caregiver. It's something that uses up our battery. We've talked about this before. And so it's just to recognize that you also want to make sure you're taking care of yourself, right? And often people feel sort of guilty or worried that they, are taking time for themselves instead of their loved one. But it's actually really important to stay charged yourself, right? We often kind of say, like, if your ship goes down, then everybody's in trouble. So you want to make sure that you're staying charged and doing those recharging activities, which we've talked about before, which are things that make you feel more energetic at the end than when you start. Recharging activities are not a list of shoulds, right? So it isn't like, well, I should go for a walk because that's good for me. No, these are actually things that make you feel more energetic at the end than when you start. And so it's about paying attention to things in your day that actually help you do that, and then trying to incorporate those into your day so that you have regular charges for your battery. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we often, are worried about our loved ones, which of course makes sense. And we're trying to figure out how to help them best. What do they need? How often should I talk to them? Should I be getting them this or that? How can I best help them? And actually, the better thing to think about is that it's not our job to figure out what they need. It's our job to ask them what they need. So we often get into sometimes a relationship, especially with elderly parents or relatives, where we're making decisions on their behalf and forgetting that they actually still have a lot of independence. They have their own things that they need, and they have the ability to tell us that. So it isn't our job to figure out what they need. Our job is simply to ask what they need. If they need help with, if you live nearby them, if that's help with groceries or getting prescriptions or things like that, or if it's about, social connection and staying in touch with them. How often do they want to hear from you? How long do they want to talk to you? Do they prefer phone or some kind of technology? So it's really more about asking them what they need and then doing our best to try to meet that need. Sometimes we can't meet their needs, right? Sometimes relatives are like, I'd love it if you'd call me every day for an hour. And that's just not a realistic thing in my life, right? So there's also a difference about acknowledging somebody's need and stating that you can't meet it than just sort of saying no, right? So a version of that is, you know what, I hear you that it actually, you'd like to talk to me every day and that for an hour would really work. I really wish I could do that for you. Like, I wish we could have that time together. Realistically, that's not something I'm going to be able to give you. And sorry, I can't give that to you, but that's really, not possible for me right now. That's a much different thing than just being like, no, I can't do that, right? So acknowledging their need doesn't mean you have to fulfill it, and it doesn't mean that you're on the hook for it. And recognizing, acknowledging, and validating their need, you can still say no to that and still put in, your own limits and boundaries to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the other part, again, to recognize is that one of the major things about the pandemic, and because of being in lockdown, and even as we move into reopening, that social connection is like a huge thing for our mental health, right? We know humans function better when they are in safe, trusting relationships. So that's just like a thing about humans, right? It's like humans do better with oxygen and they do better with stable, secure relationships. It's just how we're hardwired. And so one of the most important things we can do for our relatives is to stay socially connected with them. So, if they live far away from you, then you probably had some means of connecting with them via technology already, so you can continue to make use of that. Also, one of the things, don't assume that people can't learn new things, right? Sometimes people actually can learn new technologies. Some of them are very good at being, like the technologies themselves are very accessible, and they have voice activation, for example, if you have problems with eyesight. So you may also, again, ask them if that's something they want to try, if they're interested in it, or if they want to stick to what they're already doing. If you live close to them, you may also still not be able to see them in person, right? And this is actually one of the things about the reopening, is that everybody kind of has a different risk level, right? If you have a chronic condition, if you're in a group, by age that makes you more at risk, it's actually an individual calculation about how much risk people can take on. Again, because I work with cancer patients, I have to be much more careful because I have to be careful about what I'm bringing into the hospital where there's lots of vulnerable people. Other people, but I also have a job, so I'm not worried about the financial part of it in the same way that somebody else might be more worried about finances and need to get back out in the world to make some money. So there's an individual risk factor that we all kind of have to calculate, and it's really our job to recognize why we're making those decisions, right? It's very clear for me that I'm doing that because I'm trying to protect people who are vulnerable. And that's actually something that's important to me in general in my life. And so being clear on what that value is for me makes it easier for me to explain why I need to do that, to manage when I get, backlash from people. Not really backlash, but more like, really, you can't come to the party? It's more like those kinds of things, right? Where you feel kind of the social pressure to join in. So being clear on that helps us communicate that with other people. And we've said it here before, again, which is that it's the same storm, but we're in different boats. And so we actually sometimes have to tell people what our boats are about. We can't assume that they know what our boats are, right? So again, in the reopening, I still don't have childcare. In Nova Scotia, they're opening businesses before they open childcare. So I have to communicate that with people because there's no way that they're necessarily going to know that. So there is an individual risk for people. We want to be clear about that. And that will mean for many people that they're going to have to continue with some of the same strategies they were doing in lockdown to minimize their own risk. And so even if you are, even if you could visit with them in person, you may end up not deciding to do that. Or, if you have the ability to bubble with just them, right, then that might be a risk that you're willing to take. The other part that I find for people also is that we can often get into a role of like being a nurse or being, you know, the housekeeper or being the grocery delivery person. And the thing that's actually most important for our family members is the emotional connection. And so I often, you know, encourage people to think about, you know, what they really need is you to be a daughter. What they really need is you to be a son, right? They need you to be those parts that you can't hire somebody to do. And that sometimes we get caught up in being like the nurse and being all of those other things for our family members, when actually the part that's most important to them is probably that social connection with who we are as a person and what that relationship is about. And so just to, you know, remind yourself that that's the part that's really the most important and the most meaningful for people. And then finally, to be present. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty in this next phase of reopening. And what our brains want to do with that is they want to problem solve. And sometimes they get us to problem solve like 100 steps ahead. So for example, I noticed myself problem solving, what am I going to do when my kid goes back to school in September, right? That is a long way away. And in the life of this pandemic, so many things could change by then. We don't even know if school is going to like start again in September, and we definitely don't know what it's going to look like. And so when we problem solve that far ahead, the problem is that because we don't know enough about what's actually going to happen, we end up problem solving like 100 different options of what might happen. So if this happens, I could do that. But if that happens, maybe I'll do this. Or if this happens, maybe I would have to do this. And then it actually does feel overwhelming because we're not problem solving the one thing, the one version of the future that's actually going to happen. We're problem solving like 10 different versions of the future. And that actually is overwhelming. So even though our minds tell us that if we just planned ahead enough, we would feel less anxious, planning that far ahead actually makes us feel more anxious, not less anxious. So if you notice you're problem solving 100 steps ahead, come back to the present moment and just problem solve the next step. And sometimes the next step is, what am I going to have for lunch, right? Sometimes the next step is, how am I going to charge my battery today so that I can make good decisions, so that I, you know, that frontal lobe, that's where problem solving happens. That's where decision making happens. So what can I do to charge my battery might be the actual next step. When you get there, you'll get there. And when you get closer to it, you'll actually have more information to be able to do better problem solving. There's actually too many unknowns to do effective problem solving at this point. And so with all the uncertainty in this current phase, you know, even though there was lots of terrible things about lockdown, it was actually kind of simple, right? It was very black and white instructions about what you needed to do. Now in the reopening, there's a lot of gray areas and there's a lot of individual decision making to do. So make sure you're charging your frontal lobe because that's going to help you make better decisions, right? And also come back to the present moment. A really effective way of coming back to the present moment is just to notice something about your five senses. So your five senses are always in this moment, but you can't smell something from 2 years ago. You can remember what it smelled like, but you can't actually re-smell it, right? You can't taste something 2 years in the future. You can imagine what it would taste like, but you can't actually taste it. So anytime you're connected to your five senses, things you can see, hear, touch, taste, feel, you're back here in this moment. And so notice two things you can see. I can see the color of the wall. I can see the color of the floor. Notice two things you can hear. I can hear the hum of the computer. I can hear the cars outside my window. And in those moments, you've come back to the present moment. And again, this is one of those skills that's like a rinse and repeat skill, which is you don't do it just once. You have to do it repeatedly, right? So whenever you notice your mind taking you 100 steps ahead, our job is to notice it's gone there. Totally normal thing for minds to do, but recognize it's probably not going to help us. Come back to the present moment and then rinse and repeat. The next time you are 100 steps ahead, come back to the present moment again. And so that will actually help us feel more in control and better able to handle this next phase. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I think that was it. I was like, I think that's all. I can't remember what's on the next slide. Yeah, so those are my tips around how to support our elderly relatives, and I will turn it over to question and answer. Oh, I can't hear you. Is that me?
Sorry, I think that was me. Yeah. So a reminder again, if you have questions, just click on the icon, and we look forward to responding. I was smiling when you were talking too about asking parents what it is that they want, and it was funny. My mother was quite direct in terms of talking about her sister, and she said my cousins were actually phoning her sister, every day. So she had 3 cousins, 3 children. They were calling her, and my mom was crystal clear. I do not want to hear from each of you every day,
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it really is so critical, though, and to be able to recognize, okay, what do different people kind of need?
And we have also, sorry to interrupt, we have this belief, that in a good relationship, I shouldn't have to ask. That in a good relationship, they'll know what I want, but that's actually not true at all. It's a total myth about relationships. What actually is a sign of a good relationship is that you're able to ask for your needs in a direct and clear manner, right? Because it's actually a risky thing to do that, to ask for our needs to be met. Often we ask about it in code, it's like, what are you doing later? Versus I'd really like to see you later, or I'd really like you to call me later, right? So we talk in code, and that's a safer way of doing it in case they say no, right? In case they don't want to see you. So the sign of a good relationship is actually that we're able to ask for our needs to be met in a clear and direct manner, rather than, so we're not trying to make people better mind readers. We're trying to take the risk of asking, for what we really need in a direct way.
So there's a question here, and because a lot what we're doing is we're believing in the competencies and capabilities of our parents, and this question is highlighting sometimes where, as a person's getting older, they may not have the same capabilities that they used to. I often say that dealing with my mom, who's 90, is dealing with a 3-year-old in terms of attitude. We've worked very hard under isolation that her social life can't continue. How do we deal with it? So they have a real concern here, and they're trying to support her from a distance. Any ideas for that?
Yeah, for sure. And, even with, and certainly there is a stage that people get to where they're cognitively declining, and so they don't have the same ability to make decisions, to problem solve, and so we do end up having to take some of those things over. It still helps to try to give them as much choice as possible. So even with a 3-year-old, it's like, do you want to brush your teeth now or in 10 minutes, right? That we're still trying to give them options so they have some sense of control, but limiting what those options are. And another thing that happens often too, again, memory sometimes doesn't work as well. We know memory doesn't work as well when we're under stress also, so there's additional factors. So we do sometimes end up having to remind, our parents or elderly relatives about why that can't happen, and to also, again, validate their needs, which is, I know absolutely you want to see people. That totally makes sense, period, right? Validating somebody's experience does not include a but. It ends with a period. Right. So it's not, I understand you want to see people, but you can't do that. Right. Validating their experiences, like, I know it really sucks that you can't see people right now, period.
Yeah. The other thing too is that for the person who's asking the question is to consider that they may not be able to provide all the support themselves, and to outsource some of their support and be looking at, what type of service level. So if she's still independent, you might want to consider some in-home care. Like, I know my mother at 85, just having the person come to her house before she passed out last week is to have somebody come visit her, cut her nails, do that visit to make sure. And the other thing is to make sure meals. I think that's something that's really important with elder folks, is that they sometimes forget about their meals, and to ensure that you can also have meals and wheels and different strategies. I know the big thing for our family with our mother was to feel comfortable enough to work with her to get additional support before palliative care or respite care. So it's like Dayna said, is asking those questions, but there's a point in time you don't tell a 3-year-old, ask them a cognitive question to process. You just take them away from the plug.
Yeah. I think one of the things too, and when we look at, they were talking almost of the attitude of a 3-year-old in terms of defiance. And, you know, again, it's this idea that independent living, we can't be making all the decisions for them. There is a theme in some of the questions here around worry, that people are talking about worry that they have where because they're not seeing their parent or because of the decisions their parent is making in terms of socializing or going out or having people come into their home. And obviously we don't have control over that. Do you have any sense, and this might even be related to some of our past sessions, but how you can deal with the fact that, you know, worry or concerns that you have over someone where you can't control their behavior?
Yeah, and you know, of course, this shows up often in the pandemic for lots of reasons that we can't control what other people are doing. So again, you're best to focus on your own behavior because that's the part that's going to make you feel is controlling your own behavior and being consistent with what you think is important. You know, again, in this risk calculation for people often choose quality of life over quantity of life. And most of our medical interventions are really about extending the number of years, not necessarily the quality of life. And so people do end up sometimes choosing quality of life over quantity of life. And that's a deliberate decision because that matters more to them than how many years they're on the earth, right? The other part too is that everybody's frontal lobes are so tired that sometimes they maybe would be making better decisions in other circumstances, but because of the stress that their frontal lobes are so tired, they're not making good decisions, you know, in these circumstances. And again, helping them charge their frontal lobe rather than trying to talk them out of things might be more supportive than trying to get them to change.
Yeah, the other thing you can consider too is naming their worry and letting people know that authentically I'm worried about you at this point in time. I don't know what I can do to support you, but I'm here to help you as much as I can, so that you're passing some of it off, knowing that you've done your expression. You're not keeping it in. My concern is when people worry inside and then they start getting into some counterproductive behavior, some kind of manipulation to try to get an outcome, versus as accepting human beings have free will, as long as they're competent. And if they're not competent, then it moves to safety. And when when safety is an issue, then you need to be more decisive, like you would with a 3-year-old.
These questions are more about
the last part I'll just add in, sorry to interrupt. The last part I'll just add in too is that, you know, the 2 pieces of advice that I've been giving consistently through the entire pandemic is 1, charge your frontal lobe, and 2, seek professional mental health support, right? This is incredibly stressful to get through this. And I think we often are underestimating the amount of stress it is to live through a pandemic. And because nobody ever has that we know, we don't know how to deal with this. And so one of the unprecedented things we might need to do in these unprecedented times is to seek mental health support. Again, I think everybody should, even in normal circumstances, but we know there's still a stigma about that. But these are not normal times, right? If that worry feels out of control, that's probably really understandable. And, you know, we want to access professional mental health support to help us get through that, because there are really effective ways that we know that mental health professionals can help us manage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, we can highlight again in terms of the supports that Maple Leaf has, and we have you know, many different modalities that you can access, and we definitely encourage you to do that if you see the need. There is a question here, you know, which can be a difficult one. And before I kind of get to it, I just want to pause though, Dr. Howitt. Did you say that your mother passed away last week? What yes. Did you? So very sorry to hear that. Sincerely, I think this question would really touch on that. It says, can we address the loss of an elderly person during COVID? So not to put you on the spot, maybe we'll go sure. to Dr. Lee-Baggley first, but this is an important question.
Well, I'm happy to share what we're doing after Dayna goes. How as a family, we're managing it now.
Right. So I, you know, because of my job at the hospital, working with people who have, you know, life-threatening illnesses, I've been with lots of families when a loved one is dying. One of the things would, encourage people to keep in mind is that people often feel a strong desire to be with their loved one at the moment of death, and that's a really understandable thing that people want. Totally understandable that that's what they want to do. Again, in pandemic times, you may not have had that as an option, right? It may not have been possible for you. And just to keep in mind that, it's not really about the moment that they left. It's really about all the other moments you spent with them, right? Often the person themselves who's dying isn't that aware of what's going on. They may not even know that you're there. And so to remind yourself that it's not about the last moment, it's about all the moments you spent with them. And people can know that you're there, even if you're physically not there. We have that ability as humans. So, to not sort of, to give yourself some kindness about if that's a regret, like I didn't get to be with them when they passed, is to recognize that's not what was the most important thing about your relationship. The most important thing was all the other moments when they were alive. And that's, to hold on to those. And then again, grief functions like a wave. It's going to hit you. Crying is a social emotion that's designed to help elicit support, to help let people know that you need support. And just like, it's hard work to swim upstream versus riding the wave to shore. And if you just let yourself be sad and have a good cry, it's a lot easier than trying to swim upstream. And it's a really normal function. And it just will hit you. Sometimes it hits you because it's triggered by something, but sometimes it just comes out of the blue. And it'll especially happen at the first of everything, right? The first Christmas without them, the first birthday without them. Sometimes that catches people by surprise because it's been a while, but it's the first Halloween without them. And again, we have these memories of them. And so we end up forming a new relationship with that person because you often can know like what they would have said to you. You'd had a conversation, you can remember, oh, they would have said this to me if I brought that to them. That's that new relationship we end up forming. That can help us kind of cope.
So, Dr. Howitt, I was going to say, I think people in Make Believe feel like they know you too, and they're writing in, giving their condolences.
Thank you. I will just share one quick observation going through it. I'm about as hard-headed and stubborn as they can be, and I had exhausted every connection I could to be in Prince Edward Island with my mother, getting access and all that kind of stuff. And my brother happened to run the palliative care for Prince Edward Island, and he couldn't get me in. And so we had to come to grips. And the reality is, much like Dayna said, my mom and I had a conversation, but once my mom decided it was time, in fact, she died very peacefully because my brother was just having lunch with her, went outside to come back, and she was gone. And what happened was my brother called me, told me about this 10 minutes before I'm doing a suicide intervention course, which was interesting for me to get through that. But I mean, the reality is that it's a process, like Dayna said. The big one I have is it's navigating the fact that my mom died. That's a grief process. That's real. We all grieve differently. Me, I didn't hit. My dad died. It was 6 months before it hit me. The big one for me is regret. And words are words, and people like me, and we say things, but we need to come to how we manifest our regret. And what I'm working on in my mind is accepting that I can't control what I can't control. And I can't control the boundaries of this disease and the reality. So I think the big one is just giving yourself a break and making sure that I'll have my time with my mom when I get back to PEI.
Thank you so much. So we probably have time for one more question, and it's building on the concept, Dr. Lee-Baggley, that you talked about in terms of looking at quality of life versus duration. And the question, I'll kind of sum it up, is looking at where grandparents want to spend time with their grandchildren, and they say they're willing to step into that risk. And the parent is saying, that they're less comfortable with that. So it's a very specific example, but any thoughts on that one, just in the bit of time we have left?
Yeah, so again, I think some of these decisions are best made by first clarifying like what your values are and what's important to you and what matters to you, right? And being clear on that will then serve as a compass for how to make these other decisions, right? So, understanding whether for you it's about protecting vulnerable people. Maybe it is about having great life experiences, which come with risk. Maybe it's about fostering a social connection. So understanding what our own values are and how we want to show up during all of this will help us be a guide that then you can decide, does making that decision, is that consistent or inconsistent with what I value and what's most important to me? And again, they're going to be difficult decisions. They're going to be difficult conversations kind of regardless. And again, validating what other people's experiences are and again, help them sort of accept what our decisions are, even if it's not the same one that they would make.
Yeah. So thank you both for being with us today. Again, always a pleasure and appreciate it. Thank you everyone who joined us online. I would also say that we've completed 8 weeks now, and we have a few weeks left that we're planning for. And if you have ideas that are on your mind on topics that we haven't covered, please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you in terms of it for future speakers, and we can see if we can address those. So thank you again, everyone. I wish you a great day and look forward to connecting soon.
Thank you.